So what happens if you combine Razor with Noelle into a 5-star unit? Give him ridiculous jumping mechanics and a nasty attitude. Let's find out, shall we? What's up folks, CrossSG back with my pre-launch thoughts on Xiao. Before we get into it, this video may be a little different than most of my previous pre-launch thoughts videos for a couple of reasons. First, I have no intentions of pulling for Xiao, and I doubt this will be a repeat of my Ganyu Curiosity Cave. To be honest, I'm just flat out not interested in him as a character, regardless of how good he turns out to be. I also find his whole jumpy playstyle really disorienting and mildly annoying. I have 2 young boys, and watching Xiao's gameplay gives me flashes of them jumping and screaming around the house. It kinda makes me want to put him in the quiet corner to calm down. I also don't know much about Anemo characters. At least I had used Fischl and Diona extensively as supports before I pulled for Ganyu, but excluding the necessary initial few days where all we had was the Anemo MC, I don't think I've spent more than a couple of hours in total seriously playing an Anemo character. That said, not all is lost. Being a Noelle and Razor main could lend a hand at unraveling him a little because he seems to share some similarities with them. Anyway, I just wanted everyone to understand this going into this video. And remember, nothing is confirmed till launch day. I'm just breaking things down based on what we know from unofficial sources. Going over his kit, we see that he has very well balanced base stats, decent HP, the highest base attack in the game as far as I can tell, as much defense as Noelle has, and his ascension bonus is crit rate. Of course, we do need to subtract the base of 5%, which gives him 19.2% crit rate from final ascension. His normal attacks deal a 6-hit chain with double hits on the first and the fourth hit, and his charge attack is an upward thrust that has similar modifiers to Xiangling. And finally, we get to the apparent star of the show, which is his plunge attack, and this is about a 60% higher modifier than most other polearm units. Looking at his E-skill, he lunges forward, dealing Anemo damage to opponents in his path, and it can be used in mid-air, which is interesting, and it starts with 2 charges. It looks to have a decent damage modifier considering he has 2 charges of it, and it has a 10-second cooldown. His burst is called Bane of All Evil, and upon activation, his jumping ability is increased greatly. His AoE and attack damage are also increased, and his attacks are converted to Anemo damage, and this conversion cannot be overridden by any other elemental infusion. This sounds familiar. He will also constantly lose HP during his burst, and his burst ends when he leaves the field. So a level 6 skill increases his attack damage by 77%, which seems like a decent modifier. But worth noting is that it doesn't seem like this bonus affects his E-skill damage, it only affects his normal charge and plunge attacks, which kinda seems odd, but we'll run with that for now. It starts off at a 3% HP drain of current HP, and eventually caps out at 2% at level 7. Interesting. So if I'm understanding this right, the health drain won't be able to actually kill him because it'll always only take 2% of his current HP, effectively meaning the drain slows down the lower he gets. His burst has a duration of 15 seconds, a cooldown of 18 seconds, and an energy cost of 70. Onto his ascension talents, and the first one decreases climbing stamina consumption. The second one is a stacking damage buff during his burst, starting at 5% and increasing by 5% every 3 seconds that his burst is active, capping out at a maximum of 25%. So this is kind of similar to Ganyu C4 in a way. His third talent causes his E-skill to increase the damage of subsequent E-skills by 15% for 7 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. Gaining a new stack refreshes the duration, so getting the full 45% stack is somewhat realistically achievable then. Over to his Constellations, and C1 adds an additional charge to his E-skill. C2 increases Xiao's off-field energy recharge by 25%, and C4 increases his defense by 100% when he falls below 50% HP. Lastly, we have his C6. While under the effects of his burst, hitting at least 2 enemies with a plunging attack will immediately grant 1 charge of his E-skill, and for the next 1 second he can use his E-skill while ignoring its cooldown. Alright, that's his kit. Here are my thoughts. Right off the bat, we can see some very clear similarities between Xiao, Noelle, and Razor. His burst ends if you swap characters, making him yet another field-hogging carry like Razor. He also doesn't seem to generate energy particles from his E skill during his burst, also like Razor. Similar to Noelle, his burst increases his attack damage significantly, increases the area of effect of his hits, and converts all his damage to Anemo damage. Thus, in order to achieve full scaling with Anemo damage, we would need to have his burst up on cooldown as far as possible, and this is where I'll draw my first conclusion or prediction about Xiao. Xiao is going to play like a mix of Razor and Noelle. In order for him to deal meaningful damage, you absolutely need his burst up, just like a C6 Noelle. Yet in order to get his burst up quickly, you'll need to build your team for off-field regen support similar to how you would build for Razor. Another way of putting this is, if you plan to run him as a carry, you need to find a way to get his burst up on cooldown. If you can't do that, then keep him off-field and only swap to him when his burst is up. That said, it's honestly tough to speculate about this without actually playing him live. I mean, he could very well launch and have no problems with energy regen, we just don't know for sure at this point. Regardless, let's break down Xiao's potential problems and try to solve them. So while he shares a lot of Razor's and Noelle's strengths, he also shares both their weaknesses, all in one unit. To combat his field hogging requirements, Razor has a lot of inherent energy recharge built into his kit, 60% from his sigils, 30% from his second talent. Xiao, on the other hand, only has 25% inherent regen via his C2, and it only works when he is off-field, which is kinda counterintuitive. I mean, sure, his bursts cost 10 less energy than Razor, but I doubt that makes up for the difference in energy recharge. Now on the Noelle front, she can swap to other units during her burst to battery herself, but Xiao can't do this either. So that's basically Xiao's problem in a nutshell. And my immediate thoughts are that we probably want to have a second Anemo unit on the team for particle generation, with some additional off-field regen via the likes of Oz, Goba, or Albedo's Isotoma. That said, I'm not entirely sure if this alone would be sufficient, so I can think of two possible solutions. Our first would be how we typically run Noelle to battery for herself, which is using the Favonius Lance on Xiao. The higher the refine rank, the better, of course. What this does is it gives Xiao a little more energy recharge and the ability to generate some energy for himself during his burst whenever he crits. Now, depending on the refine rank of the weapon, it works out to about 6 to 9 particles per burst rotation in the best case scenario. Now, while this could work, I don't think it's necessarily the best way to go about it. The Favonius for self-regen works far better on a character like Noelle because she can swap mid-burst for a quick swap team. You can't do this on Xiao. Now, the second and arguably better way, in my opinion, would be to build your entire team around buffing Xiao's damage and regen as much as possible. We're looking at Team Resonance, Noblesse, maybe Exile set, running Favonius weapons on as many teammates as possible, basically supporting him the way you would support any other field hogging carry. If all else fails, go with an energy recharge timepiece and that should take care of things. Looking at some specific team examples, because I know you guys won't let me get away without giving at least a couple of examples, here's what comes to mind. First, we want to run a second Anemo unit like I mentioned earlier, and I think this is going to be pretty standard across most team recommendations. Now, who you run specifically is up to you. I hear Venti is somewhat useful in some teams. And then we could go with either Fischl or Xiangling as the standard off-field skill supports via Oz or Goba, and have Bennett, Diona, Chi-Chi, Xingqiu, or Barbara for buffs and heals. Now, Barbara is particularly interesting here because everyone has her and she's a catalyst user, meaning you could just put the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers on her and you now have your personal buff and heal bot who actually heals you above 70%. Now on to the second example, and this is a little over the top. We have Xiao, Jean, Zhongli, and Albedo. Whoa, hold up. Crush recommending a full 5-star team?
Say it ain't so, Joe.
Well, it ain't so. I'm not recommending this team, folks. I'm just speculating that this is what I would at least try out, assuming I pulled for Xiao. So back to the speculation, we have Jean for heals and Anemo particles and Anemo shred if she is C4, but good luck with that. Zhongli for shields, resistance shred, and pillar resonance. Albedo for isotoma damage, and 2 Geos for the 1.3 Geo resonance. Now I'm pretty sure the Anemo particles from Jean plus the Albedo Zhongli combo will be sufficient regen for Xiao, but in case it isn't, I'd run Favonia's weapons on all three of them for extra regen when I swap to them between burst rotations. Now the rotation itself would be Albedo's E, followed by Zhongli's E hold plus his burst, then Jean's E plus her burst, straight into Xiao's burst, and when his burst ends, use his E skill once, and rinse and repeat. Lots of AoE damage, lots of sustain, it seems like it genuinely could work. Anyway, I don't have Jean, and I'm not pulling for Xiao, so that's it for team comms. Let's talk about his constellations. Now, I don't think his constellations are that great, considering how his damage rotation functions. C1 is decent, but his primary damage source, sub C6, is his plunge attacks. Beyond the initial E-spam opener, it's just pretty much plunge attacks the rest of the way because we need to save at least one E for post-burst energy regen. He also needs to be on the field during his burst, so C2 is kinda redundant for active regen. Now his C4 is just, I don't know, I guess he loses HP during his burst, so MiHoYo wanted to give him more survivability at low HP. And then we have his C6, and if everything we've heard so far is accurate, this changes the way his damage rotation works entirely. Rather than chaining plunge attacks, we now perform something to the tune of one plunge attack into a chain of 3 E skills, rinse and repeat. Now this results in more DPS, not necessarily because his E skill does that much more damage than his plunge attack, but rather because his E skill can be chained that much more quickly than his plunge attacks, even with animation cancels. Now I know there's a lot of hype around his C6, but ultimately it's just a rotation change that results in more DPS, and I don't think it's all that necessary. Xiao looks like he will deal more than enough damage at C0 already. Besides, his C6 only works if there are 2 or more enemies, and a situational C6 on a 5-star unit is kinda disappointing, to be honest. Okay, moving on to artifacts, and I'll only be looking at Xiao as a carry because like Razor, I don't think he brings much value as a support unit. So there is really only one primary artifact build I can think of right now for Xiao, and that would be 2-piece Viridescent and 2-piece Gladiator. His burst functions as a damage multiplier, so 2-piece Noblesse likely won't do anything for him. Now I suppose going 4-piece Viridescent could work, but it would depend on which supports that you run. It could augment Oz or Goba's damage, for example. As for stat choices, we'd probably want to go with a crit stat hit piece, an emo damage on the goblet, and either percent attack or energy recharge on the timepiece. And finally, we get to his weapons and damage breakdown. The weapons I'll be comparing here are the Blackcliff Pole, the Death March, Favonia's Lance, the Vortex Vanquisher, the Primordial Jade Spear, and the upcoming Staff of Homa. All level 90, all R1 on a level 90 C0 Xiao. I use my Ningguang's gear for baseline stats, swapping the Petra bonus for the Viridescent bonus, and of course, I did the usual crit optimizations for all the weapons. Now for those who are new to my channel and don't understand what this means, I optimized the crit rate and crit damage stats for each weapon to be as close to the 1:2 golden ratio as possible while keeping all the stat weights equal. Now this allows us to compare the weapons on an even playing field because not doing so would skew the results in favor of weapons that just happen to fall closer to that golden ratio with stats from my current gear. Looking at the spreadsheet, we have the level 6 burst modifier, mob mitigation, mob base resistance, level 6 skill modifiers, and the average damage bonus from his second talent per burst cycle. I'm only including his third talent for C6 calculations because that is the only constellation where I think it would truly matter. And I assumed the full 45% bonus because beyond the first 2 E-skill uses, every other E-skill hit during the burst cycle will likely benefit from the full 45% bonus. A few other considerations to note before we go over the damage numbers. I assumed a 100% burst uptime for all calculations. All damage numbers are average damage per hit values taking crit rate into consideration. I assumed 1 stack of the Blackcliff Pole buff for reasons I've explained many times already. I used only the multi-target bonus for the Death March. I assumed the full shield uptime with the Vortex Vanquisher. The Jade Spear gets the full bonus. And for the Staff of Homa, I did calculations both with and without the full bonus. Okay, taking a look at the damage numbers, we see that in the 4-star category, the Blackcliff and the Death March are within margins of error from one another. though I'd reckon that the Deathmatch might pull ahead in practical gameplay because it provides the base buff against multiple targets and a larger buff against single targets, making it useful in all situations. Now, the Favonius Lance looks weak, but again, it's a trade-off between damage and burst uptime. How useful this will be entirely comes down to Xiao's actual regen potential when he launches. Looking at the 5 stars, and we see that the Jade Spear comes out on top. But in general, all the 3 5 stars in this comparison are still within margins of error, so it'll come down to which ones you have, what your gear looks like, and what team you intend to run with Xiao. Both the Vortex Vanquisher and the Staff of Homa require a very capable shield support like Zhongli, whereas the Jade Spear is probably the most flexible and consistent of the lot. For those wondering why I didn't include the Skyward Spine, that's because it only buffs his normal attack speed and requires the use of normal or charge attacks to activate its bonus. And of course, here are the R5 numbers for those who are interested. Feel free to pause to read it. Alright, let's wrap things up. Overall, I think Xiao has good damage potential. He looks to be very similar to Razor, so I can definitely relate to his rotation. Now, whether these numbers actually translate into truly impressive damage output, we'll only know when he goes live. As a field-hogging carry, a larger than normal portion of the team's total damage comes from Xiao, so his personal output potential has to be very good for him to be worth pulling for. That said, as always, I'd recommend waiting on the reviews or at least the day 1 impressions before actually pulling for him. And that's it for my thoughts on Xiao. Sorry for getting more speculative than normal, but I hope this was helpful nonetheless. As always, thanks for watching, thumbs if you liked it, down if you didn't, crush that subscribe button, and I'll catch you in the next one, folks.